People-pleasing is a hot topic these days. Annoying if you've never lived or thought this way, a touchy one if you're still gripping tightly to your own people-pleasing patterns, and an exciting one if you've reached your fuck it stage and you now identify as a recovering people-pleaser. Today we're mashing up two of my favorite tools for emotional intelligence, the 10 false beliefs of the people-pleaser, and of course, the Enneagram. If you're going to use the Enneagram as the transformational tool it was meant to be, then you have to go beyond just knowing your type. So let's take a look at the 10 false beliefs of the people-pleaser and examine which of the Enneagram types are most prone to falling into people-pleasing patterns. First up, let's introduce the 10 false beliefs of the people-pleaser if you aren't already familiar with them. This comes from the brilliant Beverly Angell, who wrote the book called The Nice Girl Syndrome. Don't let the title fool you though. People-pleasing doesn't know genders. We all have the potential to be conditioned into people-pleasing. Why is it necessary to familiarize ourselves with the 10 false beliefs? Because any personal growth demands self-awareness. We have to be aware of the non-conscious belief systems operating within us if we want to break cycles. We might look at our people-pleasing behaviors and decide that we want to stop them, but how can we really do that if we're not aware of the belief system that's driving them in the first place? If we can know the belief that's floating around in there, then we can have a better understanding of the thought or logic behind why we're functioning the way that we are, why we feel particular feelings that further drive the behavior. More on this incredible loop in another video. So here they are, the 10 false beliefs. Number 1, other people's feelings are more important than my own. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. Here we're focused on other people's feelings, reactions, and experiences at the cost of checking in with our own selves to know our feelings and our needs. You put aside yourself to tend to others. And remember, for a lot of people pleasers, they're actually guessing at what others feel and need, and not necessarily checking in or using communication to clarify their assumptions. And in that process, the people pleaser is actually changing what they think, feel, and need in anticipation of what another person might feel in attempts to keep them comfortable, happy, or pleased. Number 2, if I'm nice and fair to others, they will be nice and fair to me. This one is magical thinking. Sure, it might be a nice way to open up dialogue or begin an interaction with kindness, but all of us have been on the receiving end of someone who chose quite the opposite. Your kindness does not ensure that another person is going to mirror your behavior, but the people pleaser buys into the idea that if they just keep working and trying harder at that kindness, they might be able to change things. In fact, they might even go so far as to fault themselves if someone doesn't offer kindness back to them. They assume responsibility or fault and then end up digging their heels even deeper into this false belief. Number 3. What other people think of me is more important than my self-esteem, my health, or my safety. Let's look at this one as 3 individual statements. I like to break this one down into 3 different components because a lot of people look at this false belief and flippantly decide that they would never put their health or safety at risk for another person. But specific examples can help us see that maybe we have. So first, what other people think of me is more important than my self-esteem. This could look like someone making a joke that meanly targets something about you, or the content of a joke is something that you're actually quite self-conscious about and you say nothing. You might be more concerned with appearing easygoing or like you can take a joke that you don't honor what you're actually feeling. The second part of this false belief is about health. So you might be over at someone's place, you might be out with a group, or maybe even in your staff lunchroom, and there's food that doesn't really fit in the way of your goals and what you're trying to achieve. But you eat it anyway, or you go out for the drink anyway so as to appear not rude. That's physical health. We can also break this down into mental health, where you might continuously attend family functions or participate in traditions with people who have unhealthy boundaries or consistently cross yours. But you attend so that you don't appear to be the ungrateful child or be perceived that you might be judging them as being better than them. The third part is safety. So you might get into a vehicle with someone who claims that a certain amount of alcohol doesn't affect them. You may stay living with someone who uses physical intimidation to control you, or you might caretake for someone who's known to be physically aggressive when you don't have the resources to handle those kinds of situations. These are just a few of the ways that you can put your physical safety at risk for the sake of appearing in good light, whether that means you're seen as helpful, dependable, kind, you name it. The bottom line of these 3 things is that you stay stuck in unhealthy behavioral patterns so that others will think of you in a particular way. Number 4, if I'm good and perfect, I will be accepted and loved. Pretty simple. There's a fixation on perfectionism here, whether that's in performance, your appearance, or the way that you speak with others. There's a fixation on presenting yourself as perfect, though perfect is a moving target. So people pleasers are constantly trying to figure out what a person, a crowd, or an environment expects of them, and then they're trying to be that thing. Number 5, if I act naive and innocent, people will take care of me and I won't have to grow up. This one's a little bit tricky because when people first read it, they assume that it means you're not smart or knowledgeable or capable of learning. But that's not the case. There are plenty of intelligent, highly accomplished people who behave in ways that undermine their own intelligence in order to people please others. For example, you might pretend to not know something just to avoid conflict. So this permits the other person to continue behaving the way they were, healthy or not, because of your unwillingness to confront. You can pretend to not know that something is hurtful. You can also pretend to not know how to do something, which permits other people to just keep doing things their way. Number 6, I don't have the right to stand up for myself or act on my own behalf. An example of this could be how you perceive people's statuses or titles. So in the presence of someone older than you, maybe a parental figure or a superior, you believe that you're just supposed to do as you're told. Number 7, anger is a destructive emotion and shouldn't be expressed, especially directly to those with whom I am angry. Tons of us never had exposure to what healthy anger looks like. We only know meanness or loud, aggressive anger. So people pleasers want to keep angry emotions at bay. So when you feel anger, you might actually refuse to identify with it. You might say that you're sad instead, or that everything's fine, but really a boundary or a belief system has been crossed, and you'll do everything that you can to hide your experience of that emotion and avoid communicating your true feelings. This can get so bad to the point that you don't consciously know what anger feels like for you. Number 8, it is better to avoid conflict at all costs. This one goes hand in hand with number 7, so you might change the way that you think or feel about something in order to keep the peace. Now, number 8 doesn't necessarily assume that you feel anger. You might view having different interests as conflict. So a friend might ask you to do something and you're like, yeah, sure, just so you don't have to state or own your own preferences for fear of the rejection or abuse that might come from thinking or feeling something different than another. The same way that you might avoid saying to a partner, that's not really how I want to handle this situation with our kid, fearing that it will lead to more conflict in the relationship. Just to give you 2 examples. Number 9, there's good in everyone, and if you give them enough chances, they'll eventually show it to you. Similar to number 2, you just keep giving people chances in the hope that they'll change or behave in a more desirable way. A people pleaser buys into the belief that even if their own boundaries are being violated, you should just keep giving someone another chance. Hopefully what you're hearing is that some of these false beliefs assume others. So for example, if you're buying into false belief number 9, you're simultaneously buying into numbers 1 and 2, potentially 3, 6, 7, and 8. Number 10, women need men to protect them and support them financially. Believe it or not, this list was developed by Beverly in 2008, and you'd hope that this idea would be long dead, but not so much. And yes, in many ways, times have changed, and when I teach this in my coaching practice, I thoroughly enjoy the fact that most people snort laugh at this one. However, if we break this one down or even take it down to a simple statement of women need men, so many people are still buying into this belief system in the way that they won't leave unhealthy relationships because they believe it's better to keep the family together, or they'll stay in a relationship because they still believe that being single is some sort of failure. So you might scoff, but think hard about whether or not you still believe this one. Whew, you did it. I always like to tell recovering or current people pleasers that this is deep emotional work. Identifying with these false beliefs brings up a lot of uncomfortable emotions, so go at your own pace and be kind. And there's a lovely pause button down here if you need time to process things now or throughout the video. Each of the Enneagram types have particular characteristics associated with them, but we don't type based on behaviors. We type based on unconscious motivators. So that's what we're going to look at here when we're examining which of the types are more prone to becoming people pleasers. Keep in mind that healthy individuals, no matter what their type, are not leaning toward people pleasing. So for the sake of the video, assume that we're talking about the type in their average to unhealthy states. Here we go. I love that we're starting off with 8s, starting strong in a type that probably leans farthest away from wanting to please others. Their unconscious motivator is to mask weakness and vulnerability by appearing strong and powerful. An 8's operating system is driving them to mask their feelings, not deny their own feelings and needs. So their assertive energy and directness doesn't have a whole lot of time or patience for a lot of these false beliefs. And being well acquainted with their anger, it's relatively effortless for them to enter into conflict when they feel it's necessary. Now, that's not to say that 8s can't be people pleasers or engage in people-pleasing behavior. Like any of us, they may do it with a particular person in their life. I'm just saying that given the motivator, they are less likely than any other number to engage in that behavior. Nines, on the other hand, are one of the types most likely to suffer as people pleasers. They're motivated to keep peace and harmony by avoiding conflict at all costs. Right there, we see at least 2 false beliefs solidly operating. And don't numbers 2 and 9 look like solid tactics to keep peace and harmony? And remember, 9s were also fed this idea really early on that they don't matter. So there goes number 1, number 3, and number 6. Now look at this, they've already got 7 out of 10 checked off, and we know that 9s tend to merge with others around them. So how much sense does it make that 9s are also at risk of number 5? We're at 80%. Now, wings will also play a huge factor in a type's tendency toward people pleasing. For example, a 9 with an 8 wing might be able to dispel some of these false beliefs more so than a 9 with a 1 wing. And I'm not going to assume ugly number 10 on any of the types, but please keep it in mind as you're doing your own reflections. So why would a 9 with a 1 wing potentially struggle more? Well, 1s are motivated to improve themselves, others, and the world around them. False belief number 4 starts looking real tempting then, doesn't it? So let's do 1s. We suppress anger because anger is not an appropriate or acceptable emotion if we're perfecting ourselves. So right off the hop, we're going to struggle with number 7 and potentially number 8 if we're more concerned with perfecting how we present ourselves. If we're hung up on perfecting policies or systems, we might engage in conflict for the sake of what's right. But if what's more important is presenting ourselves as model citizens, then 8 is likely going to be a problem. And if we're being model citizens, 2 and 9 are probably taking their turns at driving the bus too. Numbers 1 and 3 could easily get in the way at this point if we're suppressing anger and trying to be good. We're at a big risk of number 4, like we talked about, way too responsible to entertain number 5. And number 6, we're really driven to do what is right. So this one's a toss-up for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this one in the comments section. Remember that subtypes will play a huge role in a type's tendency toward people-pleasing. Some ones will have a moral and ethical compass so strong they won't care about people's feelings or conflict. So be sure to educate yourself about the subtypes as well. And before we move on, 1s, be mindful that both of your wings are not exactly helpful when it comes to safeguarding you from people-pleasing. 2s, they're right up there with 9s when it comes to risks of people-pleasing. 2s are motivated by the need to be needed, appreciated, and loved, while denying their own feelings. 3s are less likely to lean into people-pleasing. I wouldn't put them next to 8s, but they've got their assertive qualities and motivators that steer them farther away than some of the other types. And I find this type to be a little more complex and fascinating in the way that we can look at the false beliefs. With 3s not believing that they can be loved for who they truly are, they're motivated to appear successful and avoid failure at all costs. They're quite used to denying their own feelings, reading the room and mirroring others. So number 1 and number 3 are actually strong potentials for type 3s in some ways. I'm talking about their true feelings. 3s can put those aside if they feel that they need to gun for a certain success or achievement. In that case, they're less willing to put themselves aside. Number 2 might be more of a tactic to get what they want or need, but I would argue that 3s operate with higher senses of urgency to get things done. That if number 2 wasn't working for them as a tactic, they'd abandon it fairly quickly. Number 4 is definitely a 3's kryptonite, but not in the same way it is for a 1. 3s focus more on perfection of their performance, so when they set out to do something, they've got their sights set on the best, the biggest, the most, the first, etc. So you can see the necessity for first place for a 3 means that false belief number 4 is huge. Numbers 5 through 8 are interesting. There may be a potential if they are pleasing others in order to get to the top. With 5 and 6, it might end up being more about deceit than people pleasing. And with 7 and 8, 3s don't really let people get in their way of what they want or feel that they need. So again, they may enter into conflict if it's necessary. Their assertiveness can definitely take them right into conflict. However, they're pretty intuitive at assessing if conflict will set them back from success. And again, they might avoid it, but it would be more about deceit at that point. Now for 4s, the motivator is to appear special and unique as a compensation for what they feel is missing within them. There's a lot of shame within 4s, also believing that they can't be loved for who they truly are. That makes 1 a huge possibility. 2, 3, 4 if you consider that there is a big attempt to fit in. So good and perfect by another's definition that will allow 4s the feeling of belongingness. When you see so many of the other false beliefs already in operation, that person is pleasing from a number of different false beliefs. That makes number 5 all the more possible. And if we look at 6, if a 4 feels that something is missing within them, if they're constantly on this search for this unnameable quality, they too can be vulnerable to this false belief as well. Numbers 7 and 8 can greatly vary based on subtypes, which is true for all of the types. But just in a general 4 sense, if there isn't a secure sense of self, if something always feels missing, they may not easily identify with anger or even feel like they have a leg to stand on to express it. Plus, their capacity for empathy, their desire to connect with others, and to not want others to feel the lack of self that they experience can even strengthen numbers 7, 8, and 9. If you're enjoying learning about the people pleaser's belief system and the ways in which our Enneagram types are more or less susceptible to becoming people pleasers, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more emotionally intelligent tools. The head triad absolutely fascinates me when it comes to people pleasing. With the gut triad, I find that you can see their lines more distinctly, no matter which side of the line they fall on, more or less prone to people pleasing. With the heart triad, I find it simple to see why they might be more prone to people pleasing, given that they're projecting different images of themselves to the world, especially with the core emotion of shame playing a huge role. But the brain triad I find far less simple, so bear with me. With 5s, they're motivated to conserve resources and energy so as to not be dependent on others. So that rules out number 5 most of the time. And they're not generally concerned with being accepted or loved, so they certainly don't lean into 4 in the ways that other numbers do. When it comes to conflict, 5s rely on observations and data, so conflict is really more about an attempt at logically making their point. I would argue that ultimately they do struggle to directly and healthily deal with their anger since they're so detached from their emotions. They end up missing the point of some of the conflicts, which is to be validated for our emotions. So people-pleasing may creep in here while they're trying to resolve things logically and are avoiding their true feelings. 5s who are in the habit or pattern of withdrawing could in fact be in their people-pleasing. They may be withdrawing as a behavioral reaction to false beliefs like 1, 2, 6, or 9, but it's difficult to say because the act of withdrawing, when done healthily, can also be a way of asserting the self. So I would say that 5s fall somewhere in the middle of the Enneagram types at risk of becoming people pleasers. And 6s, safety and security are their key motivator. So what I find interesting here is that if they really believe that safety is at risk, they could lean hard in the opposite direction of people pleasing, being willing to ask the tough or awkward questions and really challenge people, ignoring false beliefs 1 through 9. But if fear is registering lower or safety isn't as big of a threat, 1 through 9 could just as easily be possible for a 6 who wants to be a part of a community and have others to rely on to keep one another safe. Again, maybe not at risk of people pleasing like 2s or 9s, but at least somewhere in the middle of the scale. Keep in mind subtypes too. This would be an entirely different conversation for a counterphobic 6 who often gets mistyped as an 8. And lastly, 7s, the big avoiders of uncomfortable emotions. Their motivator is to avoid emotional and psychological pain by imagining or engaging in a future filled with unlimited possibilities. So I think sometimes this general quality can protect them from people pleasing, but at other times drives them right into it. If a 7 is looking to avoid discomfort within themselves, they may check out physically, and now we're having a similar conversation to the one about 5s who also remove themselves from discomfort. Let's assume the 7 physically stays put though. A 7 who is itching to be done with a conversation of conflict or other uncomfortable emotions can easily become a yes person in order to just put things to bed. And then we see the false beliefs light up because they've now put themselves aside to placate another person's feelings or needs so that conflict is seemingly over and they can just move on. There's no hard and fast rule as to why someone becomes a people pleaser. It can be conditioned into any one of us. And that conditioning comes from our familial systems, institutions like schools and religions, and of course gender plays a huge role in conditioning as well. And no matter where our conditioning comes from, we adopt these false beliefs as a survival tactic. And if you're studying the Enneagram, you know damn well that our unconscious motivators develop for the same reason. So hopefully this gives you a better understanding of why some of us lean harder into these behaviors than others. But don't go. We need tools if we're going to build a healthier life. And the best tool that I can offer you if you're going to challenge the people pleaser within you is to invest in Beverly Angel's book, The Nice Girl Syndrome. It's the place you want to begin when you're learning about people pleasing. I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing her on one of my podcast shows, so I'll put the link below along with her book. Digging into the unflattering parts of who we are is tough, but she gives you the language and theories that you need to have a foundational understanding of why and how these patterns develop within us and stay deeply rooted, unless you're here, just like you are today, trying to get the work done.